The royal family was taken aback when rumors became headlines. The Duchess of Sussex, Meghan, allegedly made a startling action, sending a list of requests to royal aides in order to plan a royal return. However, what was actually on that list and why at this time? The monarchy's dreaded moment had come, and nobody was ready. Make sure you subscribe before we get further into the true implications of this for the royal family. Don't overlook any updates. The initial rumors emerged subtly, sandwiched between regular palace briefings and foreign policy gossip. However, they spread like wildfire throughout newsrooms in a matter of hours. A private message supposedly delivered by Meghan's attorneys had ended up on key palace employees' desks. Nor an appeal, nor an apology, a list, a methodical, well-organized list that reads less like a request and more like to a guide for re-entering the world of royalty. The response inside the castle was immediate and electric. In private hallways, phones rang. Scheduled meetings were abandoned by assistants. Veteran assistants, they apparently froze in shock as they read the first few lines, hardened by decades of scandal. Public recognition, re-established security, new patronage, and symbolic acts of healing. Every demand sharper than the previous, each line implying restoration rather than merely return. What most disturbed them was the timing rather than the topic. There was no crisis at this time. This was not a weak moment. This was a calculated moment. Following years of separation, litigation, interviews, and broken allegiances, why now? Why, as the monarchy seemed to be stabilizing, would Meghan choose to purposefully reopen wounds? Facts moved more slowly than conjecture. Some rumored that this was a part of a well-planned return, with music, timed to match the vulnerability of the royal family. Others said it was motivated by a desire to regain narrative control, diminishing influence, or financial pressure. Earlier, without her, history hardened. One notion led to another until a single fact emerged. Become indisputable. This was not a rash decision. Music. This was a calculated move. Even more concerning were the responses of people who had previously worked for Queen Elizabeth. Previous advisors, music, allegedly expressed modest uneasiness after retiring from public life for a long time. They cautioned that just the tone could shatter alliances that are already brittle. That a mistake here could spark new conflicts the crown hardly made it out alive. Scandal was not the source of their dread. It was concerning instability. However, the most startling information was concealed in the story's margins. King Charles had not been told, at least not at first. As aides jumbled and the monarch himself was reportedly on the road, courtiers muttered. Music. Taken out of the initial fear wave, by the time he received the complete briefing, leaks had already begun to mold the story outside the royal walls. Conjecture and growing public expectations. Music. During the initial hours, as headlines became more focused and social when the media erupted, the monarchy was left in a state of uncertainty. Not just yet reacting, waiting, hearing, not yet denying, not yet facing, determining the battle after calculating the damage. However, while the palace fumbled behind closed doors, King Charles was already aware of the situation and preparing a reaction that would send shockwaves across the Atlantic. In front of the gates of the battle lines were silently formed at Buckingham Palace. Some assistants warned of danger, while others called for reconciliation. Standing in the middle of a storm that he could no longer ignore was King Charles. Compelled to decide between diplomacy and self-defense. The royal hallways pulsed as soon as Meghan's purported demands emerged. With conflicting voices. There was a lot of disagreement in the king's private council. One side was occupied by the reformist advisors who recognized a unique chance to improve the monarchy's reputation abroad. They contended that even a small opening may usher in a new era of openness and change the institution's name. As music, contemporary, tolerant, and fearless of change. They didn't discuss appeasement, but of strategy, transforming a possible PR catastrophe into the monarchy's own redemption story. However, on the tradition and rage loomed on the other side. The response of Queen Camilla, according to initially, there was complete incredulity. Music. Following years of public examination, re-engaging with Meghan was, in her music opinion, an opportunity to heal emotional scars and reputational damage. Offense to the monarchy. According to reports, Camilla saw the requests as both bold and extremely manipulative, claiming that they are motivated by control and enmeshed in victimization. Her voice was formerly regarded as secondary in palace strategy, which was now very important. Music. But all were overshadowed by Prince William's rage. For him, the wounds had not healed. They continued to bleed. He saw no middle ground, no compromise. The reappearance of Meghan was not related to her family. Everything he and Catherine had labored to rebuild was at risk. According to reports, William, who is frequently composed in public, released an uncommon and scathing reaction behind closed doors, cautioning that giving in will ruin everything. He took a straightforward position. The ultimatums are not used in negotiations by the sovereign. Charles, the monarch and father, stood in the center of this contentious division, as well as man. He was not apathetic while he remained silent. It was turmoil within. He was recalled the days after Harry and Meghan had left. The unfulfilled family dinners, the conflicts with the press, the sorrow, the disgrace. More than that, though, he recalled his own shortcomings. His broken bond with Diana, the sons he neglected to shield from the burden of royalty. And in his heart, guilt, which he had suppressed for decades under protocol, was aroused by a shadow. Now it reappeared, begging to be felt. However, government could not be guided by guilt. The monarchy was not a place to live. It served as a symbol. And when the world's media scrutinized each leak and headlines grew, Charles sensed the walls getting closer. There was increasing pressure to make a statement. However, each manuscript that came over his desk felt sterilized, hollow, political, and cut off from the human maelstrom, whirling all around him. The organization was waiting for the monarch's word, holding its breath. However, rather than releasing Charles did something few anticipated by making a well-crafted statement or letting assistants speak on his behalf. He was started creating a message of his own, unvarnished, and very deliberate music. However, nobody anticipated was that Charles would defy convention and take matters into his own hands by sending a message that would musically rewrite the royal playbook. It was not printed on royal letterhead or read from a podium. However, King Charles's statement was unmistakably a proclamation of intent. Each and every syllable was measured. The weight of a monarch who wasn't hesitant to draw a line in the royal sand was evident in every phrase. The environment could have been a charity banquet, but the events of that night were everything but formal. Charles, wearing the symbols of tradition, stood in front of the audience and gave a speech that he had painstakingly drafted. By themselves. What had begun as a benign speech about cultural preservation abruptly and sharply changed course. Somewhere his tone tightened between greetings and parting words, and the room changed. At that moment, he spoke the term that is currently making the rounds in all European tabloids. Once broken, trust, music, has to be gained once more. Not required. It wasn't, but it was subtle. The significance was obvious to those who knew where to look. This wasn't a casual remark. It was a message, and it was obvious to those in the monarchy who it was intended for. Meghan's supposed demands had touched a sensitive spot. However, instead of mounting a formal reply or making an official denial, Charles had done something far more potent with music. He had laced his response with public grace and unmistakable steel. Royal correspondents were analyzing the words within hours. Analysts one after another lined up to validate the suspicions of many. There was no ambiguity in the sentence. It was intentional. Out there, according to insiders, palace aides had advised him to keep the speech merely ceremonial and to soften the tone. However, they had been overruled by Charles. He insisted that the wording stay the same. For him, it was its time for him to quit hiding behind protocol. This was a private matter. Nevertheless, there was more going on behind the conviction. Music, betrayal and pain. The person closest to the monarch claims that the emotion in his voice wasn't a performance. It was an actual experience. This wasn't only about royal standards. It was about relationships that had deteriorated over time, about family, and about the sting of being viewed as a relic in the story of his own ancestry. Meghan's action had made him face a reality. He had long disregarded it. He could not be shielded from heartbreak by that strength. However, there was no unified voice from the public. While many considered Charles's remarks as important and dignified, others had a different opinion. A man in a corner, a leader retaliating with sadness rather than strength. On social media, The under strain, the response broke like glass. Some saw it as a sovereign regaining power. To others, music was evidence of a crown too brittle to endure criticism. Nevertheless, Charles had communicated through deliberate symbolism rather than a law or an edict. And that change was significant for a monarchy based on ceremony. It was indicative that even rulers eventually had to come up with new methods because the old ways were disappearing, making their voices heard. However, this was only the start. The sequence of silent actions that spoke louder came next. More than words. They weren't only directed at Meghan, either. The Prince and Princess of Wales moved aside when King Charles did. Forward with eerie accuracy. Their comments, body language, and public appearances turned into a master class in royal messaging and a warning to Meghan that she wouldn't take the crown again without a fight. In the days that followed, the William and Catherine seemed to be everywhere during the king's emotionally veiled speech. The shift happened right away and computed. Overnight, their once modest and constrained schedules changed into an unrelenting barrage of interactions, public appearances, and walkabouts. It wasn't only about visibility. It was about taking back control of the story. Music. What the crown was unable to express was whispered in every stride they took. Out loud. The future of the monarchy had already arrived, and those who had left were not part of it. However, what the symbology really caught people's attention. Princess Catherine of Wales made an appearance donning one of Princess Diana's most famous sapphire brooches, an heirloom, at a significant mental health event that has not been seen in public for more than 10 years. It wasn't a style decision to royal observers. It was a declaration, music, a reminder of legacy, motherhood, and resiliency, a subtle yet potent claim of ancestry and a caution. There was already a queen in waiting for the public heart. In the meantime, Prince William made a startling statement on the dynamics of the royal family, breaking his customary silence. Via the media. Speaking to an audience in Manchester, Music, he discussed a contemporary monarchy based on responsibility rather than revisionist aristocracy that prioritizes convenience before dedication. The cheers were thundering, but sources claim that it was a thunderclap directed at straight over the Atlantic. It was swiftly put together by senior correspondents. The enhanced visibility, the jewelry, the public declaration. It wasn't a coincidence. It served as a counter-campaign, well-planned, brutal, and incredibly successful. In contrast to Meghan's William and Catherine's purported demands, which had been presented as contentious and selfish, arrived perceived as elegant, realistic, and distinctly British. The public's reaction was swift and tremendous. Assistance for the Wales went viral on social media, with hashtags applauding Catherine's composure and William's dominance in the digital sphere. It was an obvious message. People had made their own decisions. Forward, music, and there were no second chances or return tickets. However, beneath the shiny exterior, there's a colder reality at work. The princess and prince weren't just symbolizing the crown. They were defending it against stories that misrepresented their intent. From voices that had departed yet continued to seek power from a storm that had previously destroyed their family and now threatening to reappear. The palace had opted for quiet. Charles had selected diplomacy, but William and Catherine had made the decision to be present. Despite rumors and accusations, they had not music with defense, yet with might. They weren't begging. They were in the lead. However, if the royal family, Meghan was prepared to answer as she spoke via performance. And it wouldn't be through a whisper this time. It was intended to be a private discussion that would not be heard by the palace. However, Meghan's secret was revealed in a few hours. Even the most devoted were shaken by what was revealed during a meeting with a former royal insider that leaked to the media. Windsor protectors. According to reports, the encounter happened in Monte Ito. Calm, informal, music, and initially look harmless. Meghan had made plans to get back in touch with a former senior assistant, a former member of Queen Elizabeth's publicity squad who subsequently collaborated closely with Harry during his final months as a royal at work. It seems that the goal was a heart-to-heart, a method to gauge the situation and see how much of the former institution might still be open to listening. However, there was much more going on behind those closed doors than just a reunion. It was the beginning of a second campaign. In a matter of hours, rumors started to circulate. A reporter renowned for covering Sussex posted a mysterious thread. Next, another, and by the dam broke in the morning. The meeting's leaked papers depicted a duchess who was unbowed but not unconcerned. Inside sources claim that Meghan was cited as saying that she was prepared to forgive but needed recognition. A statement that echoed through the UK tabloids like thunder, pardoning redemption on her terms, but under certain restrictions. The resurrected allegations of maltreatment were much more explosive. Despite the leak's lack of specifics, it was evident that Meghan thought important palace officials still had not been held accountable. It had nothing to do with retaliation. According to reports, she said it was concerning resolution. However, the distinction didn't really matter to the palace. The headlines were self-written. Meghan requires recognition. There is a cost associated with forgiveness. The Duchess is back to fight. The line that altered everything then appeared: if the organization didn't reform, Harry would never go back. All throughout morning editions, that direct and unambiguous statement was bolded. Music. It was no longer only regarding Meghan's position inside the monarchy. The system that brought them both up was directly challenged. And it put King Charles in a precarious situation. The already unstable public opinion burst. Sections for comments filled with both sympathy and rage. Music. Meghan's supporters praised her for her courage and refusal to give up. Critics accused her of being a manipulator and of holding reconciliation hostage. Not only was the discussion popular, but it was absorbing the national discourse. All of a sudden, music. Every royal engagement, every appearance, this leak was used to understand each quiet. Music. Panic inside the palace surged. Advisors, caught off guard once more, frantically sought an answer. And emergency meetings were called. Statements were drafted, edited, music, and destroyed. The monarchy, so adept, music, was now completely engulfed in the conflict while remaining above it. The devastation was more extensive this time. Due to the disclosure revealed weaknesses in addition to chats. Regarding King Charles, the game's rules had altered, and this was a pivotal moment. Quietness was no longer a tactic. Now, diplomacy appeared to be a sign of weakness. Music. The world was observing, and the survival of the family, as well as its authority, was at stake. With the public sentiment and the media in a frenzy, King Charles, teetering, understood there was no more room for doubt. He had to act quickly. A monarch is said to never plead or beg. However, in the dark no one, not even Camilla, was permitted to read the confidential letter that King Charles composed in the corners of the palace. It was a letter addressed to a single woman. Long after the palace halls had quieted, in the dead of night, and Charles sat by himself in his private study after the royal schedule had been cleared for the morning. The headlines were still whirling as the pressure increased. However, this letter was not about strategy at this time. Music. It was discussing something far more intimate. According to people close to the throne, Charles wrote that night music was a strongly felt reaction rather than a formal answer or a monarch's command. Royal constraint wrapped around a human confession. Insiders claim that the letter was handwritten. There were no typists, no digital copies, and no drafts kept in the palace archives. It included two main threads. Music. One of sadness, the other of boundary. According to reports, Charles clarified that although the organization was unable and unwilling to rewrite its structure for a single person, this did not imply that he was resistant to sadness. He accepted the harm, the break, the quiet. Moreover, but he drew a hard line. Even for his son's sake, the monarchy would not yield. Spouse. However, there was another sorrow in between those statements. Not the kind that calls for pardon, but the kind that lingers in the heart's hidden nooks. Some people think Charles was upset about more than just the strife, but because of his own inadequacies as a father. The failure to keep his family safe from one another. The mistakes, the absence, and the burden of obligation that always seemed to overshadow love. It was a letter of contemplation rather than submission. The letter is not officially documented. Only those who are aware of it talk in bits and pieces. According to reports, palace aides were kept at a distance. Music, Camilla, typically by it was believed that Charles's side appreciated the quiet around any crisis. It wasn't a palace move. This was a man's last-ditch effort at reconciliation. Music. Not via media, not via mediators, but a king might provide his own words through the most basic and vulnerable act. After that, There was stillness. There was no response. Days went by. Everyone made statements, but the intended recipient of the letter. It's unclear if Meghan got it at all, but for Charles, the expense had already been covered. He spent 48 hours by himself in his ancestral retreat, Balmoral. No advisors, no briefings. He was regarded as emotionally and physically exhausted by those close to the event. The letter, it seems not to have lifted the burden. All it had done was remind him of how heavy it really was. The country continued, albeit within everything in the mansion was motionless. A monarch had reached out and been received as a parent rather than a sovereign. With a quiet more powerful than any controversy. Nobody could see the turning point. However, everyone could sense it. Because royal decisions taken alone can occasionally have the greatest impact, without a statement or cheers. However, an unanticipated voice entered the conflict before the dust could settle, and the crown believed the flames had been extinguished, but what she said rekindled them. When it appeared that the narrative had peaked, a Princess Diana's old confidant made a startling announcement and returned to the public eye. Additionally, the message this time was evident. Long before this moment came, Diana had been afraid of it. The palace did not provide the revelation, not from the media, but from earlier times. Diana's longtime spiritual counselor silent, long forgotten, and reappeared with an unprecedented treasure of personal writings observed by the general public. They included passages from her diaries written in the last few months of her life. Additionally, in a single entry in royal circles, a single, terrifying line instantly rekindled a wildfire. A woman will arrive, one that they have no control over. She will never submit to a crown, but she will love a prince. That all it took was a vague yet penetrating sentence. The press launched an attack. The internet blew up. The passage appeared everywhere overnight, from late-night TV to worldwide front pages. Conspiracy theorists, former courtiers, and royal observers all drew one indisputable comparison. Meghan, a woman who was married into the House of Windsor, then turned to leave. A lady whose actions have subsequently tested the monarchy's structure. Diana may have predicted this woman, but she never met her. Online the number of theories increased. Was it a prophecy? Was Diana alerting us of a second royal implosion cycle? Was Meghan's struggle the continuation of a destiny rather than the beginning of something new? Already underway. Has history turned into an eerie echo once more? It didn't matter that the writing was mysterious. Some disregarded it as poetic reflection, but that didn't matter. The timing was also perfect, too sharp, too strong to ignore. Inside the palace, alarm was apparently the reaction. Already weak due to the emotional strain of his own letter, was reportedly extremely disturbed by the reappearance of the entry. Not because he believed in omens, but only because the general populace did. Additionally, symbolism frequently carries more weight in the court of public opinion. More weight than reality. Meghan was no longer the only focus. It has to do with spirits. Of earlier errors, music has now come back to haunt a crown while attempting to reinvent itself. However, it was the moment was really shattered by his boy's response. According to sources, William and Harry are already at odds. Had a heated and infrequent phone conversation over the diary leak. William reportedly felt compelled to preserve their mother's legacy from being employed as a political tool, but Harry apparently saw the passage as confirmation, an indication that their mom's intuition had always been ahead of its time. Two brothers, two interpretations, a single legacy dividing once more. Diana's voice then came back. Through the pages of her own handwriting, not through an interview or video. From beyond that, a murmur caused more discontent in a monarchy that was already in danger. What was supposed to be an individual introspection has evolved into a national reckoning. And once more, the royal was pierced by Diana's truth. Veil more forcefully than any crown could. As the past seeped into the present, the monarchy was forced to face the one question that it was unable to avoid. What occurs if Meghan declines to go back down? What followed was pure anxiety rather than royal formality. King Charles convened his inner council and formulated a strategy. Meghan can either agree to the revised rules of engagement or she stays outside indefinitely. There is no gray region or middle ground. This was the last sentence. Unlike any previous meeting, it was quick and definitive. No ceremonial flourish, without prolonged politeness. Within a guarded wing of the finale, Charles had a face-to-face meeting with the only individuals he trusted in order to definitively end the chapter. Camilla, Queen Princess, and Prince William. Together, they would establish the limits of what was and wasn't acceptable, forgiven, and what was off the table for good. Restoring control wasn't the only goal. It was concerning preventing the monarchy from collapsing due to public sentiment, personal grudges, and generational trauma. The conditions established in that room could not be altered. If Meghan desired official appearances, working titles, charity patronages, or any kind of re-entry into royal life, then three all requirements, music, had to be fulfilled. Initially, a public apology is not concealed by words or wrapped in ambiguous regret. Music, a clear admission of the damage done to the organization and to particular members of the family. Second, music, the total and irreversible removal of all previous memoirs, documentaries, and interviews on the royal family. In other words, music, edits. Retractions were the result. Where there had been rage, there would now be silence. Music, and third, and possibly most contentious, Archie has no regal titles or privileges. Or Leet. The following generation would not be involved in the future of the crown and would continue to be private citizens. Music Palace staff spent the entire evening creating a different version of the story in case the criticism turned out to be intolerable. A well-crafted and prepared backup statement that would highlight respect, solidarity, and institutional principles without disclosing the combustible reality that exists behind the scenes. It served as protection from the media. They now considered a firestorm to be inevitable. According to sources, the ultimatum was not spoke with Meghan directly via music. Rather, it was supplied via a third-party middleman, such transnational relationship with connections to the Crown and Sussex. This comm channel was specifically selected to steer clear of spectacles. However, within hours, information about personal circumstances leaked to the press. Although the public was unaware of the specifics at the time, they were aware that a significant change had occurred. One individual, however, was noticeably silent. Harry, Prince. No declarations, no appearances, no close sources or phone conversations that were leaked. Just a vacuum and quiet that merely made conjecture more intense. Was he pulling away? Was he torn? Or was he getting ready to face his own consequences? Nobody in the palace claimed to be certain, but the one man who had previously promised to do everything in his power to keep Meghan safe spoke louder than words. The last components were in position. The doors were either swinging open with irreversible force or closing forever. Result: the monarchy had taken action. They cleared the chessboard. That was the last answer. However, the last word had not yet been uttered even when the last pieces were put, and it would come from an unexpected voice. The royal family was about to fall silent when Prince Harry published a mysterious 47-second film. Music. No spin, no titles, no palace. However, what with those few words, he altered the rules once more and left everyone waiting to see what would happen next. There was only a silent upload from an unknown account that gradually gained followers. There was no news notice or warning. Traced back to Harry. Music. The video began with just his voice, no coat of arms, no symbol, and no introduction. Additionally, Prince Harry did not beg, accuse, or provide an explanation during those 47 seconds. Music. He explained simply, some decisions are decided for us. Loyalty to love, not legacy. We create others for our kids. The screen turned completely black. The message has ended. However, the effects were only getting started. In a matter of minutes, the video proliferated like wildfire. Many languages, millions of views. All of the major networks played it again. Analysts tried to figure out what it really meant. Was it a rejection of the ultimatum from the crown? A quiet farewell to the final remnants of his royalty? Or a message to Meghan expressed the same uncertainty and struggle that the general people had been experiencing for years? Her name was never mentioned by him. He never stated his dad's. However, even the most experienced commentators were silenced by the inference. In a time when every royal remark is carefully considered, refined, and presented, Harry's unvarnished simplicity defied expectations. The truth, or at least his interpretation of it, was present without any alterations or filters. The public was split once more. Music. He was hailed by some as a guy who was at last freed from the weight of a crown that never really suited him. Others charged him with veiling and cowardice. Accountability in ambiguous poetry. One thing, though, could not be disputed. The throne was not the side Harry had selected. Within the palace, according to reports, the reaction was one of controlled destruction. There was no formal statement, not even an explanation. However, insiders claim that King Charles was devastated. Not because of the royalty, for the son he had once dreamed would return, not for the headlines. The door, which had been cautiously kept open by human weakness and compromise, now seemed securely closed. Additionally, as the royal family withdrew into silence once more as the world discussed the significance of each utterance. However, it wasn't the quiet of planning. It was the quiet of submission. The understanding that protocol could not resolve what had been torn apart by time and truth. Thus, once the lines are drawn, the wounds one thing is guaranteed when the crown is once again under threat and reopened. The royal war is far from finished. I appreciate you watching. Remember to like and subscribe, and we'll see you in the upcoming.